Well, hello there. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly. It's February 21st, Friday. If you are watching, thank you for being a paid subscriber of the Dissenter newsletter. If you're watching this or listening to this after or on February 24th, please, I encourage you to become a subscriber of the Dissenter newsletter. Go to thedissenter.org, where you'll receive updates and coverage on stories involving whistleblowing, freedom of the press, and government secrecy. Also, the Dissenter Weekly is now on well over a dozen podcasting platforms. I uploaded the audio version of the podcast to, I think, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Google. It's on player.fm, Deezer, Podbean, Overcast, Listen Notes. It's in several places, and hoping to be able to broaden the audience for this show. So thank you for being here. Thanks for tuning in. We've got some headlines, and then I'm going to dive into a discussion of the Office of Special Counsel. And I know the moment that I say that, I will now see that this episode has received a negative number of listens or a negative number of views, because that's how the YouTube algorithm deals with people who spend their shows talking about things like the Office of Special Counsel. But for you all who are engaged in these issues, I think it's important to discuss what's happening. All right, so let's get to the headlines for this week. The U.S. Senate confirmed Kash Patel to be Trump's FBI director. Patel was a high-ranking national security official in Trump's first administration. He spoke during his confirmation hearing about the manner in which government surveillance was inappropriately conducted via the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and how it was targeted against him. But Patel also has endorsed targeting members of the news media with criminal prosecutions. There was an extraordinary example of media censorship by the city of Clarksdale, Mississippi, and a judge in Mississippi. The city of Clarksdale, which is in the northern part of the state of Mississippi, saw a temporary restraining order to remove an editorial published by a local newspaper known as the Clarksdale Press Register. Stunningly, Mississippi Judge Crystal Wise Martin granted the request. The editorial was headlined "Secrecy, Deception, Erode Public Trust." It criticized the city for failing to notify the public of a meeting where a tax on alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco would be considered. City officials angrily reacted and unconstitutionally sued the newspaper for libel, which the New York Times v. Sullivan decision by the Supreme Court prohibited. And not only was this censorship widely condemned by local and national press groups, but as it turns out, an affidavit from a city clerk to the court conceded that the newspaper had a point. The city had neglected to follow state law and inform the press of the meeting. Seth Stern of the Freedom of the Press Foundation said, quote, "This case should not be viewed in isolation. It's part of a nationwide increase in baseless censorship orders known as prior restraints. But this one is uniquely egregious. City Attorney Melvin D. Miller II and all other lawyers involved in asking a court to silence the press should face real consequences, as should Judge Crystal Wise Martin, who rubber-stamped their request. Judge Martin shouldn't be adjudicating parking tickets, let alone First Amendment cases." The next headline involves Elon Musk. And Elon Musk was angry about a segment from the CBS News entertainment program 60 Minutes on the platform formerly known as Twitter, which has lost tens of billions in value since Musk bought it. The oligarch posted, quote, "60 Minutes are the biggest liars in the world. They engaged in deliberate deception to interfere with the last election. They deserve a long prison sentence." It's unclear who he would have jailed, but given Musk's power and influence in President Donald Trump's administration. This type of a threat is not one to take lightly. His post also comes as Trump still continues a vindictive and baseless lawsuit against 60 Minutes for editing an interview that the program did with Kamala Harris during the 2024 election. The next story is an update of sorts that the AP reporters are still banned by Trump. Associated Press reporters are still not being allowed access to events and press conferences, as well as Air Force One. They are barred from Air Force One. 2 journalists were denied entry to Mar-a-Lago, where Trump took questions from reporters. And Trump made it clear when he was asked about it that the ban was retaliation for calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico instead of his preferred name. White House staff also accused the AP of weaponizing language through their style book to push a partisan worldview. And that's because phrases like gender affirming care, as well as the capitalization of the B when referring to a Black person, upset the administration.
Well, I do think that some of the phrases that they want to use are ridiculous. And I think, frankly, they become obsolete, especially in the last 3 weeks, because many things have happened in the last 3 weeks. And I didn't know about that, but I would say that if they want to use certain phrases like that, and I guess some are okay, but many aren't. But the Associated Press just refuses to go with what the law is and what is taking place. It's called the Gulf of America now. It's not called the Gulf of Mexico any longer. I have the right to do it, just like we have the right to do Mount McKinley, and nobody's even challenging that. But only the essentially, it's primarily the Associated Press. And I don't know what they're doing, but I just say that we're going to keep them out until such time as they agree that it's the Gulf of America. We're very proud of this country, and we want it to be the Gulf of America. Now, the Associated Press, as you know, has been very, very wrong on the election, on Trump and the treatment of Trump and other things having to do with Trump and Republicans and conservatives. And they're doing us no favors. And I guess I'm not doing them any favors. That's the way life works. But
well, you know, Donald Trump has been very wrong on Kevin Gosztola and other journalists and news media. We're not going to let Trump dictate what we can publish or broadcast or what we can say in our news media. That brings us to our final headline. Coalition opposes Trump's removal of National Archivist. Colleen Shogan, the head of the National Archives and Records Administration, was fired on February 7th by Trump, making him the first president since the position was established in the 1930s to fire a national archivist. Shogan said that she received no cause or reason when she was notified of her termination. As a coalition of groups, including Defending Rights and Dissent, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and National Security Archive warned in a letter to Trump, this will make it even harder for an already underfunded agency to preserve and maintain government records. Now, for our main story, and I promise not to put you to sleep. The Office of Special Counsel and this battle over the agency's chief, Hampton Dellinger, who really sounds like that name just really sounds like a 1940s film noir detective. But this is a serious moment. And is there anyone working in the U.S. government that Trump can't fire? Because Trump has turned to the United States Supreme Court to convince the justices that he has unrestricted powers to remove any official in the executive branch. And not only that, he is challenging a temporary restraining order. People who aren't involved very closely in litigation may not have much appreciation for this, but temporary restraining orders happen all the time in cases. It allows judges to create some space. They are able to pause disputes. They can take the time to review a case without worrying about escalation in the the intense back and forth between parties that might actually steepen the issues or intensify the issues that are relevant to the case. So the temporary restraining order put Dellinger back in charge of the Office of Special Counsel, and that came from not just a district court, but also an appeals court. Erwin Chemerinsky, a dean of UC Berkeley Law School, wrote in an op ed for the Los Angeles Times, to side with Trump and grant him that authority, the Supreme Court would have to overrule long-standing precedents and adopt a radical theory of presidential power. This is what is known as the unitary executive. And there are students of this way of thinking that have made their way in and out of the US government for the last 50 years. Bill Barr believes fervently in the unitary executive, although he doesn't believe in Donald Trump anymore. And there are other officials that had this. I think it's fair to say that Dick Cheney believed in a unitary executive. The law, though, that was passed by Congress creating the OSC in 1978 says that Dellinger can only be removed for, quote, inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. And when he was notified of his termination, none of those reasons were listed as the reason for firing him. So this is going to be playing out, and the Supreme Court will have an opportunity to decide whether they take up the appeal on this temporary restraining order, or they can wait for a district court to resolve the matter, issue their decision on whether it was inappropriate or it was an illegal act to fire Dellinger. Then the Trump administration certainly will appeal, and then the Supreme Court would have the opportunity to hear that appeal. But it wouldn't be over a temporary restraining order anymore. It would be over the actual issue at hand. So right now, Donald Trump is arguing that the courts can't even review his decision to fire this individual. But before we get too much deeper into this, I think it's worth it to outline why the OSC is important. And most of you, I gather, probably have very little knowledge, and I can't claim to have that much more. Many of the whistleblower cases that I follow occur in a space outside of governments. The Office of Special Counsel, the OSC, is an agency for U.S. government employees to turn to when they experience workplace retaliation. According to the Government Accountability Project, which is known for representing government whistleblowers, the OSC also reviews disclosures from potential whistleblowers and seeks to determine whether there is a, quote, substantial likelihood, end quote, that what they expose constitutes fraud, waste, abuse, or a violation of the law. And if confirmed, the OSC then is able to instruct the head of a particular agency where that employee was working to investigate and issue a report on steps that will be taken to address the issue. Now, let's consider some of the work that the OSC has done, which I think is worth preserving. As Donald Trump is en masse firing hundreds of thousands of workers, there are people who are being fired who potentially would have turned to the OSC, would have used the channels available to them to raise issues. And I think that it's fair to say that at least 10 to 20% of the people who are being laid off are losing their jobs, perhaps because they fit a certain criteria of worker that Donald Trump feels will be most likely to turn on him and his administration. In 2023, the dissenter reported on the OSC when it instructed U.S. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack to investigate the Agriculture Department's largest research facility and address hazardous workplace conditions. Employees at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center in Maryland complained about labs where government research was conducted and how it had flooded. Water was pouring into the facility and ceilings had collapsed. There was no running water, and the facility went neglected for several months. For another example, illegal gag orders were issued by the Department of Health and Human Services in 2020 as the world confronted the rapid spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2021, the OSC took action against restrictions on employees' First Amendment rights and required that a qualifier be added if there were going to be speech restrictions imposed. They had to advise employees of their whistleblower rights. Another example, an OSC investigation report issued in 2021 and based upon whistleblowing affirmed that back in 2015, the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the DEA, had significantly mishandled a drug trafficking investigation. The Miami Herald had reported that 700 to 800 kilos of cocaine and 300 kilos of heroin worth about $100 million went missing near Port-au-Prince in Haiti. The DEA had been assisting the Haiti National Police, and the DEA's own report on what happened was deemed unreasonable. And that means that it was not credible in its assessment of the incident. Finally, in January 2025, the OSC affirmed whistleblower claims from TSA whistleblower Robert McLean. Long ago in 2003, McLean had exposed the failure to install physical secondary barriers to prevent violent attacks involving breaches of plane cockpits. By allowing Donald Trump to remove the person who was in this position, what would happen is very clear. The individual who is picked will be somebody who takes whistleblower claims or decides internal disputes in a manner that best fits Donald Trump's administration, that reinforces loyalty within Donald Trump's administration. Anything that has to do with issues that could reflect poorly on Donald Trump, those won't be pursued. If it involves individuals who might be considered troublemakers or potential sources of friction, then I suppose that those might be validated. If there are issues that are, I guess, linked back to the Biden administration, then perhaps the OSC chief that he picks would be correcting what he believes Biden did wrong in particular agencies. Now, as Chemerinsky makes clear, this is the UC law professor who is outlining very clearly why we should be alarmed at this power Donald Trump is claiming. He writes that the administration is relying on an extreme view of presidential power, as I said, the unitary executive theory. And this view has no historical support. The framers of the Constitution were deeply distrustful of executive authority, Chemerinsky says. Protecting executive branch officials from unchecked presidential power can be very desirable, he also points out. The Federal Reserve Board is one agency with huge influence over the economy, and That individual, right now, it's Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell is the chair. And Donald Trump has talked about wanting to fire him. He can't because this individual is not directly answerable to the president. And as Chemerinsky says, the same probably should be the case for the person that handles internal government whistleblower complaints. You don't want the president to be able to fire the person who handles whistleblower complaints from various government agencies in the executive branch. It makes sense that Congress would establish it in this way. Trump officials contend that the law creating the OSC violates the Constitution. That's ludicrous. And for what it's worth, the Supreme Court may leave everything alone, at least at this stage. And maybe later too, because the OSC is a federal government agency and it only deals with people who work for the government. So that reduces the ability of the Trump to probably persuade the Supreme Court to take a more extreme view of this agency. That said, we all know about the creep of it and the way that the Supreme Court over the last 10 to 15 years has been unraveling what we might call settled law, or how it has taken a different approach to jurisprudence that, in its own way, is extreme. One of the things, though, that I'll leave you with is Dellinger emphasized that he was if he was charged with protecting whistleblowers from retaliation and utterly vulnerable to retaliation and removal for taking on politically charged or inconvenient cases, then the whole purpose of the OSC, the purpose of having whistleblower protections, would fail when it was most needed. And if we look around and we see what's happening in government, I can think of no other time in which it was important to have a watchdog agency that could raise alarms. When you look at what Doja is doing with the oversight of Elon Musk, or the instructions of Elon Musk, the orders that are being given, the people who are being brought into these agencies, offices that are being taken over, people who are being pushed out, the way people are being fired, the I think the unfair employment practices that are proliferating with this administration. It's very clear that you need an agency like this that can work without fear of retaliation. And part of being able to overcome that fear of retaliation is being able to enjoy this law that Congress passed, that it passed decades ago, that insulates you from a president who doesn't hesitate to hold himself out there as the king. So thank you for tuning in to the Dissenter Weekly. I'm not sure about the release schedule going forward. I may choose to skip a week and put the show out for paid subscribers on Monday, and then put the show out on Mondays going forward. It seems like that might be better than Friday. It might actually be easier for me too. And so we would look at the days leading up and including some events that may transpire over the weekend. Put the show out on Monday. Monday orients you for the week that is ahead. Our main story not only can be focused on past developments, but also be tuned into the future, preparing you for where things are going with this political administration. And then the show would be shared with everyone on Wednesday or Thursday at the latest. I'm favoring that right now. It's also a little bit cumbersome towards the end of the week, based on all the busyness that I have to deal with to push this show out. So, let me know if you leave a comment, drop a comment, if there's any reasons why I shouldn't do it that way. Traditionally in my podcast work, I have put shows out on Fridays, the end of the week. But I'm feeling like maybe there should be a change. So with that, I'll be back with another show soon. Plans to put together an interview show with my friends over at Project Censored, Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth. Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth both helped me with my book. They were the people at the publisher at Censored Press that made it possible for me to do Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. I'm going to have them come and do a conversation with me, looking at the news media landscape and what's going on and unfolding in a dark way under Donald Trump's administration. Not all focused on what Trump's doing, but also focused on what the executives at these media companies are doing and the problems and the crises that are occurring at these various media organizations throughout the United States, the troubles for independent and alternative media, how to navigate censorship now with Trump in power, and so forth. I think it'll be an important conversation. So with that, I wish you the best. And I, like always, I thank you for tuning in and supporting this show.